Hello everyone, today we talk about French castles between the 6th and the 11th century. Most of this time was not even properly French as well. We'll talk about the whole of today's France and or also the areas mostly encompassed at the time by the Kingdom of the Franks and their various sub-kingdoms, later probably the Western Frankish kingdom. This doesn't quite matter per se. What matters is the fact that again, at the end, let's put it in this way, of this video, we will make our usual test. How many people did actually talk about this on YouTube? And in fact, my impression, I would bet on it, is that there is in fact much comprehensive coverage of early to high medieval French castles per se in a systematic sense. I'm sure that there is plenty of touristic information, so to say, and content out there. But from a strictly military point of view, because this is also the point of this video, there is not as much. Besides, probably some of you wonder every once in a while, Schwerpunkt, you're a PhD medieval history, you cover basically the art of war, and we all know how important siege warfare was in the Middle Ages. Why do you have so few videos? We will also see this at the end of the video again with relative playlists about medieval castles, because it may seem like, oh, that considering all the sort of battle videos, all the army's organization, tactics, and different other military stories, like we haven't quite dedicated ourselves too much to the properly to the fortifications as such. There is actually a reason for this. First of all, this is a very technical theme that requires something goes beyond, in fact, the same sort of fortificatory side of the story. But the actual reason is that most of these topics are predictably covered by archaeology. And you know that, unfortunately, differently from historians, archaeologists, philologists, etc., more than else, like insist on, in this case, also very materialistic, technologistic side of the story, quantitative data and other aspects surrounding the diggings and all this stuff that, unfortunately, and very rarely, posit the attention not just towards warfare, more dynamic warfare per se, but also the probably the idea of considering multiple castles at a time, which surely happens. I'm sure there are pretty good archaeologists making the job, but in this sense, quite rarely intersecting with a more, in fact, diachronic and comparative studying of, say, castles, say, together with armies, for example, at the same time. There are many specialists on the horizons. Obviously, we work with them, and this is completely normal. I would say from my side, yes, that I don't cover castles history too much, and in general, I actually researched it. My doctoral thesis had, I don't remember how long the individual chapter was, but it was something like several tens of pages dedicated exclusively to siege warfare. And what really I was doing there was reconstructing. I was also describing part fortresses, their spread in a specific context, but also how the assaults to them, plus obviously the blockade in general, actually worked. Right. Now, with today's topic, the challenge is heightened by the fact that we're talking early medieval times, so more distant time. I researched the 13th to 14th century in general, but not only that, properly less fortifications built at the time for a series of reasons that, and this is also what I should add, and why I said, first of all, that these are technical topics. What does that mean? It means that there is a very specific sort of background and premise and sort of general framework that should be addressed before properly discussing these topics in more technical terms. Surely videos on the more technical aspects of medieval fortifications are going to come on Schwerpunkt. There is no doubt about it. But at the same time, it's important to tell the history of, for example, here, the accessibility to the actual, say, sources, to the assessment. How can we, for example, reconstruct more or less the fortified horizon of early medieval Gaul, and from on the basis of which, etc., and especially why should we study castles in this sense? How do we connect them with the local seigneuries? Sometimes this happens also in many contexts. We have more or less an idea from historiography, from sometimes even from people that did not really write at the time. This is not the case, but it was the case in early medieval Europe in different areas. that others wrote on, and that for which there weren't many details. And we just rely on archaeology, and we don't we know more or less who inhabited those areas in a political sense, but we don't have actually explicitated connection, as we've seen, for example, in the videos about Fulk Nerra that has been hyper-studied by different scholars, and that, in fact, constitutes at that point in history sort of much easier, sort of positively, heuristically positive object of inquiry from the side of the specialists. It seems to me that for all the importance that the Franks and other peoples living in Gaul had, there isn't much of a great attention towards this period in a broader conceptual sense, right? When we talk about the 100 Years' War or even the Capetian Angevin struggle before that, there's the idea, okay, well, we'll know about Chateau Gaillard, we'll know of sort of the most famous sieges at some point of different operations. We've seen that of one under Henry V. We've seen the one of Rochester at the time of the French invasion after Bouvines. So some are really iconic, like they're also represented in movies, etc. But considering the size, the scale of Gaul in general, that remained also in early medieval times actually pretty densely populated for the time standards, for European standards in general, and also pretty rich, and already, in fact, tendentially seigneurially organized country. There are all of castles, and the castles we'll see now that naturally were more modest than the ones we're habituated to see still today, because naturally were not just later, but also much more imposing systems already mirroring the phagocytation of many smaller ones around by the time which, in fact, gunpowder artillery was already around. We should sort of focus more on probably the political and territorial meaning of these fortifications. So to dig, obviously, in the also relatively contained amount of historiography, and trying to listen, as always, very carefully to what primary sources really tell us, right? Rather than scholarship just per se, or fixating on just this or that technicality about the fortifications. Besides, I recently made not just the aforementioned video about Fulk Nerra, but so this, great encapsulator and progenitor, in fact, of the Angevin, of the Plantagenet house. But slightly before that, also a video about the Gallo-Roman fortifications, and mostly, at least, the military system that revolved around it, as a legacy within properly Merovingian Gaul, right? And that's an important starting point. Fortified sites known by terms such as castella, munitiones, or castra in Latin, they are, as you know, the pretty standard terms for different types of fortifications, had further been established already during the Merovingian period, all right, when the Franks were consolidating post-Roman Gaul, and monarchs like Clovis I, who succeeded his father Childeric I around 481 as ruler of the Salian Franks, conquered the last significant Roman domain in northern Gaul at Soissons in 486, never underestimating in this sense the importance of the civitates in a country like Gaul, because this region had been not just one of the greatest, if not arguably outside of Italy, the greatest success of Romanization, but also, in fact, of its urban framework. And Gaul has also a general geography facilitating previous, obviously, patterns of settlement, etc. Geopolitics does not exist. The entirety of probably the development of French monarchic and later statal control of the population, the territory, its defense, and so on. You can look at this from Vauban to the Nazi occupation. It's fairly easy to control these big centers that are sort of well spaced. This dates back to the times of the Celtic Oppida and the Roman cities built on them, and so this wide trade networks, like properly highways across these cities, countryside, and ideal properly for creating some internal defense, but also springing fort, like in case of a counterattack or offensive from the other side. There is a massive logistical net that had never really died out since, we can't even say Roman times, because, or partially, at least the skeleton of it existed before as well. The Romans had supplied their largest military concentration on the Rhine from properly Gaul, because Gaul was simply across the Rhine from Germany. And this had entailed the articulation of the Gallo-Roman estates and centers in a way that was peculiarly conducive to a strategic control and occupation. And by the time Clovis takes over, regardless of the deterioration that obviously Roman rule had gone under, it still largely functioned, right? This is partially true also in Spain, but let's say that Gaul will remain more orderly, let's say organized, and this will confer, in fact, the French monarchy later enormous power, as you very well know. Right, and Clovis marches into Gaul, and not just defeating the famous Syagrius, but also the Alemanni around 496, 506, overcoming the Burgundians and the Visigoths in the south, that, as we've seen also in recent videos about the Merovingian and early Carolingian period, by the way, dwelled instead from the Mediterranean side of Gaul, south of the Massif Central, largely in pretty much more robust cities than the ones of the north. Right, don't underestimate those. Like if you look at, again, Paris, Soissons, Amiens, Reims, etc., like they all had already a massive relevant. Orléans, all right, we've seen it, for example, with the settlement of the islands by the Romans, that basically could maintain with this picked cavalry reserve some control properly from the very center. Also later at the time of Jeanne d'Arc, Orléans is the center of France, the symbol of France itself, as properly contrasting all these other peoples that eventually will be knocked out by the Franks, that will incorporate these this Sarmatian, the Iranic cavalrymen, on top of the actual field and sort of stationary units that the Roman army had actually maintained in all these territories. And there are famous passages remembering how those people went on living as revered communities of Roman military tradition, effectively blending over the generations just into this broader, now Frankish-dominated world. In fact, admired and used by the St. Clovis and others. I made some videos about Merovingian army organization, especially in the age of Clovis. It was full of Roman troops, not just from this sort of professional units that had remained there, but the city militias with artillery. Like there was all still a living material culture up to mid 6th century Gaul, just like for most of Eurasia and beyond before the pandemic of Justinian. You have further affirmation of and reinforcement of territorial administrative patterns here, overlapping with settlements and their fortifications. When you think that Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity, unlike other barbarian leaders that had sort of passed through this phase of Arianism that actually ended up undermining all those other Romano-Germanic kingdoms that indulge in it, and forging crucial alliances for this reason with the Gallo-Roman Church that was controlling enormously vast estates in and of itself, in fact fortified emplacements, so much so that eventually this Gallo-Roman, initially senatorial and then episcopal elite, will successfully blend and marry with the Merovingian Frankish elite, and not only that, for that matter, there were the Burgundians, other peoples in Gaul, still the Visigoths for a while, especially in the far south, even later. In fact, with the counts, properly of sort of military tradition in the Germanic tribal background, that in fact blended costumes, that lived as prelates themselves, as proper domini, landowners with their military retinues and lifestyle for that matter as well. In fact, the same Carolingian dynasty emerges, as you know, from the union between an episcopal and properly a lay lineage, like it's Arnulf of Bishop of Metz and the Pipinids of Herstal that were counts, so lay rulers. In any case, this causes in Gaul a radical continuity, also from an infrastructural point of view, and that is, in my opinion, very, very underestimated. Right, aside from the obvious vestiges of Romanity that you can see in so many different places, think about Trier, that is in Germany today, okay, but it was part of Gaul, and that's as we have with the Porta Nigra. This happened with the Colosseum in Rome, right? There is a fortification, or at least the use of some previous civil infrastructure as castles within the same cities were very well protected, and again, the ones of Roman tradition did not die and remain always incredibly difficult to besiege. Like there is plenty, in fact, of Frankish warfare revolving around the same as we've seen in those series about the Merovingian and early Carolingian campaigns. We will continue looking at this stuff. But what really matters is the establishment of a unified Frankish realm that Clovis's heirs later divide among themselves through partible inheritance. This is important. Why? Because, first of all, there is a unified monarchic horizon that, however, still allows for these sub-kingdoms to emerge, always tied to the single and sacred blood won in arms. And so there is, from one side, the preservation of this tendentially latifundium-based aristocracy that will create properly the French nobility as we know it. So very few people controlling most of the others and the land, obviously the resources that were extracted from it, very well hierarchically laid out, sort of territorially expansive, with already very pronounced military retinues that also force, in fact, this further fortification in the various clashes between the various Frankish sub-kingdoms at some point, and that therefore carry out an incredibly continuous process of fortification. Unfortunately, the dreaded, that probably the worst of the French Revolution, deprived us of some of this awareness, meaning that all the charters, admittedly these were a bit later compared to the Merovingian era, but let's say all what we could know about the tradition of the French aristocracy was wiped out in the peasant iconoclasm and fury, the destruction of castles themselves, fires, and so on. So that this alone is one of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind. But aside from this, you really want to appreciate the unification of this disparate tribes and territories through military conquests and alliances with the church, while probably the Germanic groups settled amid decaying, but still erect Roman infrastructure, in frequent power struggles among heirs that brought, as crisis does, at least as far as this local organization within a system that was recognizable as such, actually reinforced also technological ingenuity. I made multiple videos about also the I will post them in the top fix comment down below, about proper sieges during the Ottonian era of certain Western Frankish centers that show you already how by the High Middle Ages, and this despite of lack of sort of documentation in comparative terms of the previous century, like these centers in Transalpine Europe had remained particularly active, particularly self-aware, organized in the local militias for patrolling the walls, like with sentinels, investing in the propping up properly the same fortifications, their repair after sieges and so on. And so creating that sense of community as well, of universe, a bit like the medieval city, especially in the peak centuries of medieval civilization, will fiercely, in fact, defend in certain cases. In fact, medieval French communes are a bit underrated, I think. This is true in part also rather for the Spanish ones, but even for the German ones, etc. But it's obvious that Italy there sort of led the competition by far, so to say. But in this sense, again, never underestimate how even in these imminently, in the most feudal country ever, like cities themselves and castles, even in times of general pacification, even in certain parts of the same French heartlands that were not struck by any particular war for long times, foreign invasions and so on. The castle itself was a necessary cornerstone, probably, of seigneurial establishment, control, domination, and just rule that simply mirrored the hierarchy of that particular society and culture. But back to our early Middle Ages, especially in hilly or mountainous regions like the Auvergne, these early defenses capitalized on volcanic landscapes and rugged terrain that naturally deterred invaders, allowing communities to endure raids by neighboring groups or internal feuds without relying on complex construction techniques imported from antiquity. Auvergne, we never really made a video about it, if not for the 18th century part of the Gévaudan-Wolf story. Speaks of that, but Auvergne was in fact also a relatively less developed place, very much sort of asleep in its mountains and forests. In fact, was mostly a land of monasteries that in some cases were very powerful local lords, right, territorial seigneuries themselves, but they didn't have the expansive and in that sense of militarized capacity to especially conquer other polities or communities. Of course, it was a lay authority. I made some videos about a bit the difference between the northern and the southern Gallic geography in the early Middle Ages that properly shows different archetypes. Like the idea is that the Franks from the north are much more cold, rigid, bringing in this militarized, virile vibe, right, probably of Apollonian rulers, whereas the south was much more Dionysian and feminine. Think about the myth, the stereotype at least of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the same idea, for example, that volcanic terrain harbored this more powerful netherworld toward the Mediterranean, and that in this sense, these less developed communities could hang on this natural infrastructure, so to say, is an idea that you can get of Auvergne, that, however, also was ruled at some point by the Visigoths. Well, first, there were many overlapping influences for that matter. But it's obvious that probably in the earliest Middle Ages, it was easy, say, terrain acquires, sort of regains a greater importance that it had in the past. Right, the world is less pacific, so first of all, there are more threats around. It's always a matter of politics, and since resources are very scarce, materially speaking, it's easier just to move your own community towards hilltops. This is something that happens throughout the migration era in many parts of Europe. Gaul, again, gets a fairer deal than other parts of the West in terms of invasions and especially of distractions, but indeed was also a rich enough land to see a lot of military dynamism, and so the local communities organized themselves accordingly, especially for defense. That's what they mostly adopted, like shutting themselves down into their own fortifications and waiting especially for raiders to go away. But it was, most of warfare was actually and always tied, as we just said, to local feuds to begin with. Now, Gregory of Tours, the Gallo-Roman bishop and historian who lived approximately from 538 to 594, and whose 10-book history is commonly known as the History of the Franks, serve as the chief surviving narrative source for 6th century Merovingian society by recording political violence, royal successions, ecclesiastical affairs, reported miracles of saints and broader social dynamics across Gaul, for instance, using precisely these words when describing the naturally defended site of Chastel-Marlhac, an isolated hill spanning roughly 40 hectares, surrounded by sheer cliffs about 30 meters high, yet lacking any artificial bastions, exactly for this reason. So a poor defense. Again, we've seen also in other times of civilizational crisis, for example, our mid-14th century, how even the fact that cavalry partly declined was due to the fact that armies were shrinking, and terrain in relative terms was gaining more importance, right? There was just a single line, less defense in depth, and so terrain was more important in a way. In this period, actually throughout the 6th century, you can see that Clovis's armies were the typical sort of regional force of 30,000 men. Towards the end of the century, his successors were basically killing one another with hosts that looked more like hunting parties than anything. So a very ad personam thing. You can imagine that a mountain at that point, that in other times would have been probably overrun or being indefendable to begin with, like because of also the scarcity of resources on top. We studied mountain warfare in the Frankrieg for that matter. There is a reason why you can't simply win things by, never regaining the offensive, so to say. But at this point, in this desolated landscapes of the later 6th century, would have acquired a much greater relevance. Besides, as you know, Gregory of Tours that thought highly of Clovis and used him as a also partially idealized version of leadership that his successors in Gregory's days had fallen short of, insists on these brutalities, on these feuds, on the idea that the entire world was sort of a bit falling apart, right? Consider that, again, if you're born and raised in a context that is already basically late antique, and you see what things look like after here, again, by the end of the 6th century, you're going to have sort of tendentially darker view of at least the current times. This reflects how, by the way, early medieval defenses often relied more on topography and natural barriers than on extensive man-made engineering, allowing local populations to seek shelter during raids or feuds common in the unstable Merovingian era marked by frequent civil wars and royal heirs. The same could be said actually about the same identical places for pre-Roman Gaul, right? The Oppida, I also made a video months ago explaining the same, like we're in many ways, we are naturally fascinated and in front of the largest ones, but imagine that these were not proper cities. They didn't have much of a pre-organized topography. They had historically developed quite gradually in these spurs and these hilltops and so on, and the Romans actually had built the cities that still survive at this point and would have a greater fortune in the history of France, actually in lower, more open places, because they could count on their walls and they were much better located just even to control the surrounding territory. So you have an involution, so to say, a return to a more to a poorer and less safe actually time in history, with a great, again, especially material scarcity. There were probably very few resources to erect fortresses to begin with, where stone, timber were less available. That's why moats with at some point dirt and other, but were much sort of simpler, more effective to erect, but because properly locally, like there was less of an authority and so less resources surplus to put together. Equally, artillery, contrary to what was normally believed, was never quite forgotten from ancient times. It's not like, I don't know, people in the 7th or the 8th century did not know what a torsion catapult really was. It's simply that what do you do? Do you spend enormous resources to create such an engine for storming a moat, right? Doesn't make any sense. There were admittedly probably many more siege machinery than we realize. That's in fact an aspect that we tend to always underestimate also for later times, because we get the idea of the bigger pieces, but the smaller ones obviously would have been not just more numerous but more obvious in any other military context. And so we can imagine that the darkness of these ages is such just because of specific lack of documentation, which is not it's not directly proportional to probably the level of development as well. This is unequal, and so it's obvious when you look at specific sources, numbers of troops. Armies also did not say they became smaller on a regular basis. It's not like they simply scaled down in a broader regional sense. If they were to mobilize tens of thousands of men, this was done. This pauperistic and minimalistic idea of the early Middle Ages is absolutely ridiculous. Like armies all across the world, the civilized world could put together tens of thousands of men if there was a ruler of a broader regional dimension for, admittedly, a great effort. But the idea that simply armies were scaled down, there was no resource, it's a catastrophistic view that for some reason people like to help when looking at history, and that is sort of simply debunked by the same evidence of numbers that do not seem to change, particularly in scale, in frequency, maybe in size, in absolute terms, yes, but in scale, not quite for the type of operations required. Now, needless to say, again, besieging a city was very difficult. And at this point, it is difficult also for many and other advanced times in the Middle Ages, as well as in history, right? Also, ancient polyurcetic is equally, in some sense, overly, possibly overrated in pop culture, meaning that everybody has grown with the stories, the documentaries on the siege of Masada, and with the massive sort of monster catapults that the Romans had with their torsion engines and everything. But those were enormous and amazing and exceptional at the time already. Like it's not like the Romans used artillery normally as for simply smashing the walls, and in a different way that the medievals did. Like the scale of effectiveness and employment was the same. And actually, in many ways, medieval artillery, but pre-gunpowder artillery, was even more performing than the Roman one, but not because, again, they were specifically more or less advanced, but because in order to destroy a fortress that is the product of feudalism, you need some more concentrated fire and power than destroying, for example, some towers of a specific city that is sort of easier in some ways even to penetrate with more also habitual means. The artillery was a mean to support the siege, was not the resolutive mean like you would imagine like in a video game. Now, by the time of Pippin the Short rose from mayor of the palace in the Carolingian line to king by deposing the last Merovingian ruler, Childeric III, in 751 with crucial papal support from Pope Zachary, and would launch campaigns that subdued Aquitanian resistance while securing southern frontiers against lingering Islamic presence from earlier Umayyad incursions into Gaul, and Charlemagne, that obviously reigned from 768 to 814, involving extensive military campaigns across Europe, legal reforms through capitularies that standardized administration and justice, and promoting learning via the Carolingian Renaissance that revived classical texts, including sort of scientific ones at some point, with architecture. So actually, the fortifications improved partially because of this, even though we know fairly few about it, because very few of them were actually made of stone, ex novo in particular, and encouraged manuscript copying, as you know, in monastic scriptorial became ever more, in that sense, endowed, and in many ways fortified themselves, especially during the later Carolingian period and the second invasion started. You have figures like Alcuin of York coming across probably the channel, standardizing Latin along with educational practices across a vast realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, right? And in all of this, you can imagine how varied Carolingian military activity had been. We partially saw this already in the early Carolingian video, like the sieges, especially of the southern cities. We talked about Aquitaine. Aquitaine actually was, it's often considered, like, since it had sort of more Roman legacy, that was also very Visigothic, at least as far as strict identity in nature was concerned. It had to have particularly urban, thick urban framework, so to say. And this is very often misunderstood, in my opinion, how advanced already northeastern France and Belgium really were in terms of, especially northeastern France, in terms of local urban centers and how fortified they already were. The mistake normally comes from the fact that Aquitaine, in a broader sense, very often is a synecdoche for other things, like the Atlantic side of what had been, in fact, the original Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse was not particularly, even in Roman times, particularly or deeply Romanized or fortified. The part that gets often, in this sense, mistaken for Aquitaine, that was really very urbanized and fortified, was the ones from the side of the Mediterranean, essentially Septimania, or Gothia, as it was known, more or less today's Languedoc-Roussillon, that together, by the way, with the Ebro Valley, so the continuity in the south with Catalonia, etc., was one of the most historically Romanized and urbanized, and this sense also rich parts of the West, and that, however, had in many ways witnessed to the disarticulation of first the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, then the one of Toledo, by the Franks and the Arabs respectively, and so had basically lost a great deal of civilizational re-edition capacity, so to say, but had maintained in this defensivistic sense many fortified centers that must not be confused with some broader Aquitanian world, right? Telling the truth, part of the issue derives from the fact that in later Roman provincial repartitions, certain places were eventually called with different names from the ones that had before and later. You can imagine the variety of fortifications existing here. For example, Charlemagne employed 9 months to besiege and finally capture the Longobard capital of Pavia. This was the longest siege in the entire Carolingian warfare. That shows how difficult it was to actually sort of curb a center in spite of the massive forces with which the Carolingians had managed to break the locks in the major Italian valleys garrisoned by the Longobards that basically break in open field, but managed to put up this extraordinary resistance. The Franks had found out the hard way already at the beginning, at the end of the 6th, the beginning of the 7th century, when they had partially entered Italy themselves, especially in trying to dislodge the Longobards together with the Byzantines. So there is an idea. And this is very well supported by all the various sieges of places like Avignon, Arles, in particular in Provence, basically belonging to the southern part of the kingdom of Burgundy. The north was effectively subsumed by the Franks, also in a broader ethnic sense. And so underscoring that sense, Provence, Provincia, the deeply still continuative material culture of Mediterranean Europe as far as urban centers and their fortifications were concerned. I don't know if you have ever visited those places like Nîmes or Arles. The arenas themselves there are, as they were used at the time, probably fantastic fortifications if you really want to lock yourself into it. How do you even... there are ways to attack them, to have reason of it on the same broader wall, so that's where not really what the siege revolved around, but in general, like, you have a level of internal stability as well conferred by this material safety that is remarkable. Except, again, it's the Franks with their much more proactive mentality that managed to subdue all this population. So it's always, we all know how giving the initiative to the enemy is detrimental and bad. But sometimes the defensive does work, hopefully for a counterattack as well. You have the Pyrenees with a very long history of Frankish infiltration since probably the earliest days, at the detriment of the Visigoths, ousted from Toulouse. And you continue these adventures, and you can imagine all these valleys dotted with specific castles. Sometimes they were, again, very, very primitive, very simple, but effective, because they were mostly not just one castle controlling everything, but a net, right? One aspect that gets often forgotten, not particularly stressed, is that in medieval Europe, on a regular basis, it's not just like fortification was normal given probably the character of settlements and the insecurity, the instability of the times, but castles that were built properly out there in correspondences of villages, of towns, were to be counted basically in every square kilometer there was one, right? We're talking the entirety of Europe in practice. Admittedly, well, okay, this is perhaps in some of the densest places, but still by that scale, and more or less this alliance, especially with Southern Gaul and beyond. Like the reason why it would be less, for example, in northern France, is not much a matter of local poverty. It's the fact that the place was much more politically united, so needed sort of less, even though they existed, also these fortified emplacements that were very often containing also the fodrum, the precious fodder for the war horses. The Carolingians had installed a massive logistical infrastructure that allowed their armies to cross Europe for hundreds of kilometers on a regular basis, practically virtually every year, right? And we tend not to picture this because it belongs to a past where the same documentation that does not allow you even to be amazed by it, because for them it was so normal for this thing to exist that they didn't even need to explain it to you, right? Frankish armies were thus in the Carolingian period laying siege not only to former Roman cities that still retained their late empire wall circuits, but also to modest rural strongholds that amounted to little more than entrenched camps, and that, however, still required their attention, because if you went past them and there was still somebody inside, those could harass your supply lines and try with minimal effort sort of threaten the cohesion of your entire army with just very few mobile parties that would carry out this relentless hit and run tactics in your rear lines. All right, so that's also part of the reason why you needed to stop at everyone. It wasn't much of a concentrated power force that could simply clear everything in the moment. So obviously the bigger armies would be able to go across great parts of enemy territories with many of these castra, generically speaking, surrendering the moment, because obviously there was a massive moral pressure put by armies of the size of ones of Charlemagne, as a matter of fact. But still, we see important sieges that were perhaps also not so sung by the sources, but that were, in fact, part of a different world. The Mediterranean one was more urbanized, and in this sense also more autonomous, and sort of one that could reverse more quickly to independence, in particular in the presence of sort of allied forces. For example, the Italic kingdom was by far the most fortified, was the one to which, as we were saying also the other day in the video about Louis the German with his cousin Louis II, was the one with which probably imperial authority in the empire was attached to and resided. And that was historically also under the Longobards a country of cities, and where the Franks, when arriving to conquer the land, installed their finest nobiliar retinues, right? They sent the finest high nobility of properly in Austria, famously enough, in these key places, especially the marks and the duchies of the northeast and the center, because of the possible threats and especially the risk that local rebellions of the local Longobard Italic population had been just recently subjected would bring to major reversals that they could not afford, especially considering also the role that Rome had for the entire architecture of the Carolingian Empire. There were the Byzantines around, right? So you understand also why it's so difficult to simply say, okay, well, let's talk about castles during half of a millennium of French history, because it's immense. Here, think about the second invasions that will start in a while, and how relevant even, fortified bridges were on the Seine to successfully, at the end of the day, stop the Northmen that eventually turned to England for a reason. At that point, it was poorer, but in this sense also more it was softer for as far as incursions were concerned. But back to the Carolingian era, Pepin, for example, conducted prolonged sieges such as that of Bourges in 762. These were actually middle Gallic cities, and technically in the south, but actually the Franks managed to expand also ethno-linguistically the Languedoc a bit south of the Loire itself. But that historically had been the boundary with the south, with the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse. At this point, it's a fully Frankish land, basically, even though, yes, it's at the sort of the frontier with Aquitaine, but these systems start really to look very similar in these at this latitude in particular. Where in 762, here Pepin's forces employed circumvallation and contravallation lines alongside siege engines to isolate the defended town held by Aquitanian loyalists under Duke Villafar, ultimately breaching walls through sustained pressure and logistical superiority drawn from different tactical traditions blending Frankish, Roman, and other influences. The garrison included Gascon levies, many of whom were captured along with families after the fall. But it's extraordinary that, of course, and why shouldn't it have been, but still considering the size of Bourges, how sort of thorough this siege was. Circumvallation and contravallation, it means that you're not just blockading the city, but you're defending yourself at the same time against any possible relief force. I mean, these are the same places where, the great sieges of Julius Caesar at the expenses of the aforementioned Celtic Oppida had taken place, and they had remained these very places, the theater of such onslaught. In fact, Bourges was the same location of Avaricum that was after Alesia, basically the toughest siege in the entire Gallic Wars back in the day. Charlemagne's forces regularly targeted both urban centers and smaller rural fortifications, and the latter case was especially the one of the expansions into Saxony. Right, this region of prolonged resistance involving repeated revolts by Saxon leaders like Widukind, forced conversions to Christianity, mass deportations, and the infamous massacre of Verden in 782, where allegedly thousands of Saxons were executed. This theater is actually, we should have dedicated many more videos about it, because we made multiple videos about medieval Saxony in general that gets always so a bit like the Viking era. Everybody cares about medieval Scandinavia for that, but what about later medieval Scandinavia? It's also very interesting. There's a lot of warfare. Why does nobody talk about that? And with Saxony here, the main issue that we also made a video about the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, which is as a starter now some years ago. It's not actually the fact that there were too many rural fortifications or something, but in fact the lack of the same. In fact, it was very difficult to find surplus to control the territory. It's not much just the fact the Saxons were, particularly strong as a people among the ones that the Carolingians had to deal with. It's just that the whole land, just as it had been difficult for the Saxons to unite, or to defend for that matter, because obviously the Carolingians could walk into it, but was difficult to anchor around certain specific centers of power to begin with. And so hence also the deportations, the forced conversion, priests used properly as spies basically to check on whether the local communities, fundamentally the local chieftains down in truth, were to subscribe to the new religion, so to say, even though again these lands became actually a great success of Christianization. The point that I always make is that what was actually done by the Carolingians. Saint Widukind eventually had himself baptized, and actually the Vodanic elite was the one that more quickly secured like this idea that there was a Catholic horizon within which they could keep moving in the same Christianity, with a notorious continuity of Vodanic symbolism in between that was perfectly compatible. I made lots of videos about the Helian, the Ludwig's Lied. There is properly an Eastern Frankish literature that is incredibly eloquent. So the Carolingian Empire ends, the Saxons do not revert to any kind of pre-Christian cult. On the contrary, they become Holy Roman Imperial Catholic monarchs themselves, with a great benefit for the country to begin with. But initially, you understand that the Franks had gone into Saxony with the clear understanding that initially this was just like a lost investment, that things would have just started bearing fruits on the long term, right? And this was also an obvious necessity, because it's not like one day Charlemagne woke up and said, okay, let's go destroy the Saxons because they're not Christian. No, the Saxons had been historically harassing the Frankish frontier, in particular the Rhineland, for centuries. And so at this point, there had always been a lot of warfare between the two, as historically also the tribes before even the enucleation of a Frankish kingdom had beaten one another. And so Charlemagne gets it over with for good. And in fact, this Saxon conquest to, in fact, the Franco-Roman civilization is one of the greatest accomplishments of the Carolingian military that succeeds, where the Romans had sort of failed or at least stopped, namely the conquest of the entirety of Germany, right? The massacre of Verdun likely did not witness the execution of thousands of Saxons, in particular the chieftains. Surely some were killed, but the emphasis on bloodshed is something that the Franks were particularly into since the very early Merovingian era. Many of the aforementioned Gallo-Roman bishops sort of created hymns and songs properly to stress bloodshed in terms of self-sacrificial. In fact, the divine transfiguration on commission of the same Frankish rulers definitely were considering properly this concept of Bluterweisheit, and the idea that's a bit like the Saint Bowden, that in order to acquire higher understanding of the higher spirit must in fact sacrifice himself as well. So the parallelism of Odin hanging himself, Christ being crucified, is fundamentally the same, and it resonates deeply also in the Carolingian passion for, especially Charlemagne's, for the Old Testament. He thought that it was David reincarnated. The Franks were absolutely excited by these ideas of their own hematophilia, right, and the god lords of battle that descends into the ranks. In probably in this holy enterprises is a hallmark that we will hear the echoes also in the chanson de geste, in this clamorous affirmation of a great imperial Catholic traditional power. All right. Then you have, we were just saying before, other theater that is sort of diametrically different, Italy, right? Radically fortified and urbanized, with an incredible interconnection of all these lands. Civilized, literate, local dukes are, properly administering justice with a great deal of written culture and practice. The Carolingians import as much as they can of all these models to the north, even though they can't quite adapt there. And Italy was marked by interventions against the Lombard kings like Desiderius. The Franks wanted essentially to secure papal territories and establish a sub-kingdom under Charlemagne's son Pippin, that would actually die at the siege of Venice in the lagoons against the Byzantines at the time. This was actually a price paid, probably in siege warfare at the highest level, by Charlemagne. And against also these rebellious dukes in regions like Benevent or Friuli that were more difficult to subdue for different reasons. As we were explaining before, the Italic kingdom becomes the cornerstone of Carolingian imperial legitimacy. The empire is attached to the Italic crown, and unlike any other people in Europe, Charlemagne wears both the crown of the Franks, aside from the imperial one, and the Longobards, so elevating the two peoples at the same level. Historically, actually, the Franks and the Longobards really much admired one another, even more the Franks, the Longobards, for reasons that now we don't have the time to anthropologically and sort of even militarily descend into. And so conquering, but once you knock out the main center of power, as we've seen at the siege of Pavia, you could reasonably control most of the Longobard kingdom, namely the main center of power being Lombardy and Tuscany, that would in fact keep emerging historically as the most fortified centers in Europe. I also made a video about the Italian circle of the communal civilization that flourishes in these hubs, in the wake probably also of the Longobard, and also in that sense also heavily Romanized administration of the kingdom. What the Franks do is that they change the name from Longobard to Italic to make it sound less sort of ethnic, this sort of Germanic competition-wise, so to say, in the historical memory of both peoples. But the frontiers, as I was hinting at before, are very complicated to handle. I already made a video about the frontiers of the Carolingian Empire, and I made a video about the Carolingian domination of Italy as well that shows these issues, like most of the strategic ones. Benevent was the largest, at this point, de facto independent, or at least autonomous, duchy in southern and central Italy that had historically always actually been aligned with the Kingdom of Pavia. There was even a Beneventan king at a point. It was also historically connected with Friuli. Paul the Diacon explains you why. Again, I like to throw you these anecdotes here and there, but we don't have the time to cover everything in this single video. It's obvious that being in the far south of the kingdom, it was very complicated, especially considering the mountainous southern Italian hinterland that has barely any coastal plain, especially in fact around places like Benevent, Salerno. It makes things very difficult to control. Like the Byzantines are next door in places like Calabria and Apulia, and so this partially mirrors what had happened at certain points with other Longobards duchies, that the same kings of Pavia routinely arrived. Maybe if they had done something wrong, that they had not threatened the unity of the kingdom, but they tended to be replaced by an army marching on the city. However, when the army withdrew, the locals could re-elect their own duke. And Benevent, there are other polities I was just mentioning here, including Capo, that will sort of detach themselves, but it at this point remains a principality in between the two empires, right? Also later on it will be absorbed by the papacy, probably the city of Benevent, at least in the Norman times, because they dedicated themselves to Rome rather than being controlled as Longobards by the Normans. And this frontier is very difficult. I want to make a video about the expeditions against Benevent, because historically also the Byzantines had tried at some point with a pretty big siege to subdue Benevent, but they had failed back in the Longobard era. Friuli, I made an entire video about the battle of the Livenza River. That is one of the big enigmas of Carolingian warfare, because very likely the Franks won this battle, but they may have suffered enough losses to basically broker with the local Longobards a deal to some conditions of power sharing, or at least some continuity in the local ducal appointment. In fact, as I was saying before, the Franks were so worried about any possible Italic revolt that they smoothed initially the passage between from Longobard dukes and Frankish counts, facilitated by the fact that Longobard dukes were in theory not hereditary figures, and so at their death it was already the Longobard king prerogative to sort of appoint somebody else, including some local officials, even though this wouldn't continue in Frankish times. And the Battle of Livenza witnesses the so-called Austrians, that were the northeastern Longobards, essentially the northerners aside from Lombardy, that was called Neustria, like in the Frankish kingdom in the north, to rebel, because they thought essentially, here there is the history of how the Franks had seized Italy, that had become a client kingdom in conditions of weakness of the very last Longobard king, that was basically a puppet figure created by the Franks and the Pope, right? And these guys had said, well, that guy was a Lombard, but as Austrians we haven't been defeated, and so they rebelled against Charlemagne, that rushed, even though he had he spent properly his time. Normally they would withdraw in winter. Instead, no, they immediately moved to Italy to arrive in time in the following spring, because this was a big uprising and it needed properly this major clash on the Livenza. This is important because there is a Byzantine frontier, a Slavic frontier, and the Franks need to secure everything in a way to assert their universal rule also over, in the Mediterranean. I made an entire video explaining how this is basically a sort of long awaited consequence, so to say, especially from the side of the Franks, but also from the side of their enemies, namely the creation of an empire that included Italy, which was basically cut short during the migration era from to the Merovingian side by the plague, the fragmentation we were talking about before. Now, consider that the practice, especially of defense, entailed many of the places we just described, whether, again, you take this Roman cities in Italy or some local villages, Pagi in Saxony, in northern Germany. They function primarily as temporary refuges for the local population when danger loomed. Obviously, depending on the size and the relative defenses, they could be taken over more or less quickly, all right? But imagine literally entering these countries and knowing and seeing that people have they have abandoned their fields, they have moved with their cattle inside the fortified place. It would have been really almost apocalyptic to witness. And just think that the drama, the tension, the tragedy of it all to begin with, the plunder. I mean, the Franks were not particularly kind-hearted when doing all of this. They were sort of exalting the manifestation of their imperium. And let's be honest, the only thing the Franks knew about were swords, horses, war horses, and land. This is the entire horizon of the Franks, for that matter. Warfare, and that for this reason, they knew also how to do it better than everybody. Mostly considering the fact, however, that they had developed this more, in fact, advanced elite. And so, their armies didn't look practically any different from the ones of the other continental Europeans in the West. Can you say that, I don't know, a Carolingian Frank looked different from a Longbard Arimanus? No, as far as we understand, they had the same identical equipment. The difference was made by the fact that the Franks had a much more collectively trained professional class of heavily armored mounted warriors that was more scarce in other countries, was less systematized in other countries, that had the same model but just less developed, right? That's it. Right. Where it's just a matter of quantity, again, you can't say that, I don't know, an equivalent elite Longbard was sort of less than a Frank in that sense. But if you have a smaller army, or at least one that less regularly wages war collectively and therefore lacks a sort of more robust logistical system, where this is nothing to do with what the Franks have, all right? The Franks are able to pull off this magnificent feats, especially of logistics. This is not really a time in which strategy allows particular distinction. The same Charlemagne is a giant, mostly of organization, right? The crossing into Italy from two valleys, the Susa one, the Great Saint Bernard, this pincer movement against it's something utterly insane. Like, it must have required an enormous level of organization and stockpiling. We're not talking about the amphibious operations along the Danube that destroyed the Outer Khaganate, right? That's also an incredible feat to pull off in and of itself. But you understand, here the Franks were very well equipped for all of this, and for this reason were also successful. They were morally superior in some greater sense, and this showed also in their violence, for that matter, as it was properly used, for that matter. They managed to, after all, create this dominion without destroying the peoples that they took over, but on the contrary, integrating them in something much bigger that co-opted them and elevated them. At the court of Charlemagne, you had, as we were saying here, Alcuin of York, Benedict of Aniane, that was a Visigoth, Paul the Deacon, and many others, all right? The same Eginhard, from more like Frankish Germany, his biographer himself. So a great European intelligentsia as well. Consider Paul the Deacon was the relative one probably of the leader of the aforementioned Austrian revolt against Charlemagne, who also successfully interceded for his brother at some point. Aristocratic and royal estates organized around their central curtas almost invariably included some form of defensive works as well. And this is true everywhere at home, right? Sometimes there were rebellions, sometimes there were also closer enemies. Think about the Bretons, that the Franks did not care enough about, because objectively places like the rest of the Danube, securing Germany, conquering Italy, securing the Spanish market, were sort of much more important than coping with Brittany, so to say. But there had to be, and this was all very homogeneously distributed on the territory, as we explained before, this level of not just fortification, but of in fact, resources that were stored behind these walls. Within these administrative and social hubs, the main buildings were grouped inside an area of 1 to 1.5 hectares, on average, naturally, protected by an earthen embankment that was often accompanied by a ditch and reinforced with a palisade made of beams, stakes, and interwoven branches known as baia. As a second, larger but similar enclosure typically surrounded the curtis itself, its irregular outline encompassing gardens and cultivated fields, literally for local sustenance, right? And so not just in terms, okay, we'll make the cattle enter from the countryside or the people with it, or we will also, there is all the matter of the corvée. I made lots of videos about the vassalic beneficiary system. A great part of the success of the seigneurial system and its consensual affirmation is the necessities of defense of the countryside, and the fact that, in fact, great part of peasant, sort of the harvest reserves, were preserved by the lord in these castles that could thus maintain, also for a while, to supply people who fled from the countryside in case of invasion when within these precincts. And so taken together, these arrangements offered only limited protection, if you think about it, but they were very effective as a net of defense. Right? Individually, they possessed no real strong points that could not withstand a determined siege. As we said before, many of these places in front of a field army would normally sort of give up, particularly with the small number of defenders usually available that, however, still in theory can make the difference. Telling you the truth, if you look at also higher and later medieval warfare, you realize that typically castles were built throughout the entire era for allowing a disproportionate defensive advantage from a tactical standpoint, and so that even a handful of opponents could hold out for a significant time. That was necessary to be both for in many ways, and especially for waiting for a relief force to intervene. And that said, more impressive fortified complexes did exist even earlier, and these were all in hierarchical order and strategic connection. These bigger centers feature stone walls. These were more frequent just in the Mediterranean. There is all a path to encapsulation that, like in the more conventional medieval sense, starts basically in Italy from the region around Rome in the mid-10th century and basically concludes itself in the Baltic by the mid of the 12th century. For telling you how different material culture and proper wealth was across Europe at that point. But there already were, naturally, occasionally, rarely, if you want, these stone fortifications, in part deriving this just for the greater surplus accumulated in the bigger centers, right? They weren't normally like entire wall rings, like many could be just filled with more conventional type of cheaper type of defenses. This is true also for the Roman walls. At some point could crumble in some places. They could be repaired just with, not with stone, right? But they had towers, war machines. What naturally matters in every siege is not really the type of physical sort of material composition of the fortification, quantity of the fortification. It's how much manpower is actually there to defend it, and to sort of how much the population actually supports that, right? No siege can occur if the decisive moral majority of the people inside the settlement does not want to fight to sustain it. A notable example of these bigger fortresses is the palace built as early as the 6th century near Koblenz by Saint-Nicetus, the vigorous bishop of Trier, who lived roughly from the late 5th century until around 563 or 566. So it's still basically a late antique reality. It doesn't matter how these areas of Belgica had sort of de-Romanized themselves over time. Still, the most important strategic centers there were obviously still, in fact, quite at least militarily stiffened by the various rulers. Saint-Nicetus rebuilt the local cathedral at Koblenz after migration era damage, in fact, using imported Italian artisans. I think this is really striking. I mean, the fact that you have in Merovingian Germany, you can say this guy was born almost when the Roman Empire was, not say still there, but almost, and late antiquity is still alive. And he actually has people from craftsmen, artisans from Italy that is the same place where the Romans were to help build, in this case, even the local cathedral. So for telling you how actually also civilized Europe really was to a degree, and this was not just about the brutal place with the barbarians and the threat and everything is dark. Oh my God, no, this was an open, clear kind of international situation. Besides, Saint-Nicetus excommunicated kings like Clovis I when necessary for moral failings, actively promoted pastoral care and church discipline amid moral and political challenges in the Moselle Valley, and also faced temporary exile before returning, as described by Venantius Fortunatus, the wandering Italian-born poet who lived approximately from 530 to 609 and composed panegyrics, hymns, including famous ones like Vexilla Regis that we were actually mentioning before, probably about this sacred idea of also the imperial rule at the time. And descriptive verses, in fact, while documenting Merovingian architecture, landscapes, and patterns during his travels from Italy through Gaul to Poitiers, where he later served as bishop as well. Bishops were foundational in so many different aspects of post-Roman Europe, if there was even such a thing like a post-Roman and post-imperial Europe, even in the West, as they were entrusted, in fact, with the welfare of the local communities. And when lay authority failed at controlling them and defending them, it was bishops that normally spent money, just because they lived in the cities, something that especially the early Franks did not quite do with the same. They actually did, telling the truth, but there's this idea that they had some more super urban vision of power. They could and would control the kingdom also from this massive country villas and residences as well. But the bishops were always in the city. They were historically, like in the Roman ecclesiastical administrative models, always central, always present. And they took care, as we've seen in many videos, also during the late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and beyond, to the defense of their cities. And very often successfully so, because they knew very well, they cared. They were to take that stand and incarnate that level of sanctity that bridged the earth with heaven, also as far as the Holy Ghost, and so the imperium was concerned. Fortunatus highlighted the site's impressive stone construction at Koblenz, including a lofty hall on marble columns and fortified elements with potential relic towers or a chapel, illustrating how bishops could commission substantial defensive and residential structures, blending Roman techniques with emerging medieval needs amid ongoing instability. All right, great part, again, still Roman infrastructure is there, at least the way the Romans had left it already, and so in great part it was also kept working to some degree. That we have an idea that everything was sort of switched off and nothing really worked anymore. It's not quite the case, and there was just very often like a simply rewiring, sort of distancing from the same, not for lack of commitment. Indeed, resources were very scarce at this point, but some also different type of organization given the new political and strategic needs. Now, between the 10th and 11th centuries, a new and increasingly common type of fortification appeared across the Gallic landscape. We are in the post-Carolingian period, when the vassalatic beneficiary establishment of the Franks is fragmenting the political map of West Francia, while still holding great power, but starting sort of from the bottom up to, in fact, establish private seigniories. that did not erase royal power, but made it more difficult in the immediate time to simply affirm itself. Not because they were poor, there was this immense crisis in a, for example, strictly material sense, but because with the overexpansion of the empire, there wasn't much else to conquer, and this militarized class of elite, of noblemen, decided to start building their own private powers. Right? There hadn't been really a boundary within Frankish society historically for saying that you couldn't, in fact, live out there alone as a free leader, right, of men, because already Gaul, as we've seen, was basically lots of people in charge, and so being able to affirm their own power and being needed by the king in the expeditions while lording over large amounts of the population at the same time, right? At this point, over expansion, things are also sort of scaling up in terms of overall international awareness, civilization, literacy, patrimonial policies. Think about all the monasteries funded and run by the families at this point. So I made lots of videos about this period. It is one of the single most important. Nobody in conventional pop culture has ever conceptualized, probably the post-Carolingian era. And this is the period that, as we were saying before, witnesses encapsulation as we historiographically intended, right? There are beautiful studies by Toubert, for example, and many others. From there you can find, even if they are dated, like all the bibliography or whoever is mentioned in them, it's more updated works, like the entire picture of what we know through the sources of the time shows you a lot of method in history that is not simply citing things, but reasoning over actual primary evidence. Now, the central element of encapsulation was the motte. In Latin, variously called, because there wasn't a standard term, like in a pre-Linnean context, as motta, ager, or dunio, right? Motta would stand for motte. Ager, as you know, is the standard term for basically the field fortification of some sort, or the same ditch together with it, and dunio stands for dungeon, right? And the motte, such, was, so in French as well, was an artificial, truncated, cone-shaped mound of earth. If you really want to make it very simple and sort of effective. Standard dimensions for the most widespread type of lower tier, essentially motte, expandable, especially at the local level, included a base diameter of about 30 meters, a summit diameter of 10, and a height of 5 to 6 meters, though larger examples could measure 60 meters at the base, 20 meters at the top, and stand 10 meters high. The base surface area ranged from 7 to 30 airs, while the upper platform varied from 3/4 of an air to 3. A ditch, 3 airs, a ditch commonly encircled the foot of the mound, and a wooden palisade crowned its summit. This motte-and-bailey model originated and spread particularly in regions like Normandy and Anjou, at least as far as we sort of can track it. It was pretty much everywhere, like in France, telling the truth, but it intensifies because these places are more exposed to particular military dynamics and political concentration. We are from mostly the late 10th century. There's a very advanced period where things tend to stabilize in terms also probably of the Western Frankish kingdom. In fact, we've seen in the videos of a count like Fulk Nerra, Fulk the Third Count of Anjou, who ruled from 987 to 1040, that the beginning of his reign is in fact the same one of Hugh Capet, that sort of creates what we more conventionally understand as a probably the Capetian dynasty, and so some form of more nationalized local rule, abandoning some at least of the earlier reunifying Carolingian ambitions in already direction of feudal monarchy of the High Middle Ages. Fulk Nerra deserved a video that I recently made. This was a prolific castle builder who constructed or reinforce dozens of strongholds using rapid earthwork methods with local labor to assert control in contested border zones against rivals like the Counts of Blois, enabling quick deployment against adversaries in an age of fragmented authority following Carolingian decline, and pioneering such constructions. I made that video to show how deeply chained this encapsulated net really was, how much we know about it thanks to archaeology, and this is some of the, in fact, most sort of the earliest level of encapsulation we can profitably document in a fairly comprehensive and complete sense for the places. And it shows you how there is properly a mechanism. Like during this period, there were sieges we've seen in that videos, especially about Ottonian warfare, that show you how there were some mathematical proportion, given that more or less warfare was pretty homogeneous across post-Carolingian Europe. How many men do you really need normally to, in terms of numerical superiority, to overcome an enemy defense, like the one of a city, for example? All right. We've seen in the video about Fulk-Nerrat that the distances also between these castles that at some point were built ad hoc, or at least surely they were built normally on some settlements with some fortification that we know relatively few of archaeologically before this time. That they were created at specific distances that matched the ones probably of the speed of march. We've seen it also in the video about Orléans and the Alans back in the day. Because if you managed to stop a bigger army at a certain point, you knew that you had a certain amount of time before that castle collapsed. So even though politics and strategy are fairly unpredictable, on the shorter term, you know that if you pin the enemy down by bogging him in the siege of a specific castle, you have a certain amount of time to intervene if you have naturally enough resources, and you can also move the same in the expectation of an enemy onslaught across, in fact, these internal lines that help also saving resources, protecting them better. We're talking very short distances at some point, easily coverable, especially in a day of march. And the same naturally was true for this was nothing innovative. Say Fulk-Nerrat is remembered because he was particularly energetic. This guy went multiple times on crusade, so he was an all-round Western nobleman of his era in particular, and a man of war. And for them, here we're not spending much time on describing the context, but this, again, is a very advanced stage situation where local polities have already started evolving into provincial principalities that play at the highest levels, at the highest stakes of Western Frankish royal policy. So these castles that he can build are really many, and they mirror that level of political and strategic involvement. Proving adaptable for rapid construction using local labor and materials, which allowed lesser lords to establish control points quickly during periods of feudal fragmentation and private warfare, these mottes were probably the hallmark of encapsulation. It would rapidly transform, in fact, the entirety of Europe. What we're saying before, starting from the era of Rome, after basically the end of the Saracen invasions and the unlocking, in fact, of resources for not much, in fact, external defense, but local domination of territory, right? This is what matters the most. Like, this thing spreads for 2 centuries up to reaching northeast Germany. In fact, at that point, and encompass the entire vassalic beneficiary Europe at this point. And this is the highest level of encapsulation in ever seen at that point in history across Europe. A vivid contemporary description from early 12th century Flanders captures the typical construction process. It says, "It is the custom of all the richest and noblest men of the region to erect, by heaping up earth, a motte as high as they are able to make it, to dig all around it a ditch as wide and as deep as possible. These are hyperboles, obviously, and to fortify this motte along the entire perimeter of its upper part by means of a palisade of planks joined very firmly together in the manner of a wall, to furnish its circumference as far as possible with towers. Inside the palisade, in the center, a house is built, or rather a fortress, which dominates the wall, arranged in such a way that the entrance door of the said dwelling is accessible only by means of a bridge which, starting from the outer edge of the ditch and resting on a series of pillars placed 2 by 2 or even 3 by 3 at the required points, rises gradually, crosses the ditch with such a slope that it reaches the motte exactly at the height of its edge and opens directly in front of the door. Right, so it's the most typical idea of motte that we have historically. And this account, attributed to observers like Lambert of Artres, active around 1194-1203, this was a chronicler from the frontiers of Flanders who detailed noble lifestyles, feuds, and family histories, like the Historia Comitum Gisnensium. I have very deep memories of this when I was a child. You have no idea why, but I will probably make a video about it. Underscores the social drivers behind such builds. So feuding nobles seeking dominance over rivals and inferiors in a landscape of contested authority where these structures combine residential, defensive, and symbolic functions, as the source eloquently explained. Flanders is part of the Kingdom of France, telling the truth, almost all of it, in an ethnic sense. It is a slightly rougher land than the the Romance part, also straddling it, but it is also, in fact, one of the earliest controlled by the Franks. So there are lots of castles. Flanders, the same Ile-de-France, Normandy, Britain are a bit like England, Champagne, etc., the cradle of medieval feudalism. Tournaments, knights, it's sort of so very spiritually clear how sort of this fortifications are the products, in fact, of such background, right, as well. It's not material culture per se, it's probably a form of organization of the world. Some of these are also fresh races. They sort of emerged relatively recently in history to affirm themselves into this more encapsulated scenarios. And so I have multiple videos on the County of Flanders. If you're interested, we'll talk about Flemish warfare soon, hopefully. Now, many castles were built on naturally advantageous locations, as we've seen in the early Middle Ages, but obviously this was true at every time. We're thinking of rocky spurs, plateau, or isolated hills. Yet even in these cases, traces of added earthworks are frequently found, most likely linked to the wooden tower that rose above the site that was essentially the culmination of the military engineering of the time. It had to be the most robust and impregnable part. It's basically the citadel within the fort. This will continue as a general concept, also in much more complex fortificatory systems, including cities and multi-circle castles. This general model allowed for considerable variation and refinement at the same time. Castles could be established on previously unoccupied ground, but they were also frequently built on the sites of earlier curtes. The curtes is the court, all right? In English, you have historically the manor, right? And different countries have, in fact, different terminologies in regarding the motte, but still, all right? In the latter situation of the earlier curtes, two main approaches emerged. In some cases, military requirements took precedence. All previous structures were removed to make way for a completely new, coherent, and functional layout. In others, the existing arrangement was largely preserved instead, with only an artificial motte added at the most suitable location. The two successive sieges of Puisay in 1111 and 1112 demonstrate how a lord facing urgent pressures in the early 12th century could move from the second method to the first. As the castellan of Le Pusey, there was a strategic holding in the Beauce area tied to the ambitious Montlery-Pusey lineage, whose members included crusaders who participated in the First Crusade and engaged in power plays with Capetian kings like Louis VI, as well as neighboring houses like the Counts of Blois and Champagne, adapted defenses under attack, shifting from incremental additions to a full redesign amid wars that highlighted the fluid nature of early feudal fortifications as well. Again, these were very volatile, but we don't see many of them or traces of them. Like if we dug all across Europe, this is sort of impossible for a strictly economic point of view. How much we have dug is way more than we even think. But again, there were easily tens of thousands of these fortresses across the entirety of even just Western Europe. And again, of different size, but still, right? And in fact, also from a political point of view, because at this point, feudalism starts getting structured in a broader institutional legal framework, in parallel, in fact, with the vassalitic beneficiary ranks and relations. These castles fell into three broad categories. Some were held directly by those exercising public authority. So, dukes, counts, or lesser lords who possessed the banal lordship of this fortress, because you could not really erect a fortress without public permission, right? So what happened actually is that, especially in the post-Carolingian era, this had happened all over. They had sprang out like mushrooms. And only later they were basically recognized by the general sort of regulations of the kingdom in a broader political, legal, social sense, as held to exercise that same public authority on behalf of the king. So that was the ultimate authority. In France in particular, it was a kingdom. Now, others were granted in fief to officers, relatives, loyal followers, or vassals. A third group consisted of unauthorized private strongholds constructed illicitly or in secret by adventurers, and especially by powerful individuals without the approval or even the knowledge of the territorial prince. And obviously, all these three levels somehow overlapped in certain cases. So we see the guy who owns it legally, and so obviously this quite hostile mean of territorial control. This, I can't stress enough, encapsulation did not happen because of the second invasion, say the Vikings, the Magyars, the Saracens. It happened because those raids struck Europe, but they happened in the same place relatively rarely, right? Or at different, in fact, an important amount of time. Encapsulation started appearing everywhere uniformly, and we know that this went in parallel with the affirmation of local seigneuries to control the entire system. As we've seen before, actually encapsulation normally starts, at least in some cases, after the second invasions, because there is more stability and therefore castles can be built probably in the center of the plains. Because normally the few fortifications were built ad hoc to stop the second invaders were on passes, on places that where eventually you would not build a castle otherwise because it was either too unpractical. There were naturally castles guarding passes, but there were often just ad hoc temporary emergency measures. Like what you really wanted to control historically everywhere is the big center in the big fertile plain. If you control that, you have the upper hand strategically. You don't have the upper hand strategically if you live at the outskirts of the productive areas on a mountain, so to say. So while there is a tactical advantage to control, like a hill, what matters if that hill is, however, capable of controlling a much more sort of flat land that comes with all the goods that come from there, controlled by you, etc. That immediately provides you, if you are again a lord with your retinue that can defend these communities, the guy in charge, right? This is incredibly important to understand. Then you have, in fact, veritable systems of fortifications held by a single one of these lords that could even be scattered across hundreds of kilometers already by the 10th century in Europe. Right? There are some places that are very monetized, for example, like northern Italy, that witnessed the construction of castles by some people that eventually simply sold these castles because in any case they were needed, but they weren't the people who had the means to simply garrison them. So the local noblemen purchased them in some way. This is extremely interesting, but you had, I don't know, some castle swapping because, I don't know, if you wanted to rationalize your power at the territorial level, you had an inheritance from a branch of your family somewhere, even in another kingdom, in another country, and you sold that in exchange for something else locally. So this happened all the time. It's an incredibly fascinating topic, as incredibly intricate. We partially discussed it. And so from the other point of view, if the king is at war with a guy that is building castles on his own, which happens all the time, and many of these people will also be eventually recognize the banal lordship over these castles, by the way, and the relative communities of the districts. There is war, and these places are technically not, these buildings are technically not allowed to exist, or at least they would have to be seized by public authority. And this happened through sub-infeudation, as we've seen here. It's whoever could control that on behalf of the legitimate authority decided them would do. So you understand how complicated it is, but how, at the same time, how much control and discipline it required, because, again, the castle, as we explained before, entailed a specific capacity of defense that is exemplified by medieval Europe to the extent of the political fragmentation nominally existed, but that should never confuse sort of the novice of medieval history, also military history, into presuming that since the system was politically fragmented, it was not cohesive. As a matter of fact, France was the one that initially witnessed this larger level of scattered encapsulation in a feudally systematized way that hampered initially the spread of the monarchy, and that eventually made it the strongest and most powerful in the 13th century. So we should actually drop. And also, if you look at the previous centuries, it's not like the Capetians were isolated in the Ile-de-France. They didn't have control of other parts of France. They did, right? Even pretty far away places. But paradoxically, it's that feudal glue that initially sort of is difficult to move on. It becomes the bedrock of some of the greatest powers in the world at the time. People normally don't have an idea of this because, again, they assume that the Middle Ages were just a place where it was difficult to rule. And I don't know, if they look at a bigger thing on the map with the same color, they say, oh, look, this is more powerful because it looks like it. No, all right? In terms of relative control, it's not like the Byzantines had a greater control on their territory than the French as a whole had, right? And it's not even so difficult to get the French in agreement to storm Constantinople eventually. So that's something which you may want to notice. Also because many Akrita in the same gradually feudalizing Byzantine Empire, especially in the Comnenian era, are Westerners as well, that live not in a very different way from the one in the West. So you have a very interesting embedded picture. And the Banner Lordship is quite interesting as a concept. I already explained it, but I also made lots of videos on it, especially in the early days of Schwerpunkt, because it's one of those concepts that really deserve your full attention if you have any meaningful ambition as a medievalist, understanding the difference between a banner lordship and a laudium, for example, or just different, what does vassalatic beneficiary system really mean? What's feudalism, why we call it like that. I made lots of videos on this. There is probably a playlist called Seigneurial Europe, so if you're interested in all this terminology, the legal framework, the territorial organization, you should give it a look. Together with the history of peasantry, for example, and the same aristocracy. The ban referred to the right of command and justice that were the highest lay authority, the ones coming with the imperium, often claimed by lords, in fact, armed with the cingulum militaris, which could legitimize or contest castle holdings in an era when central royal power remained limited and local magnates frequently asserted autonomy, just also, for the sake of the local communities. That was an opportunity that you would have not let slip away if you had any capacity to intervene. Admittedly, when I was saying before that the fact that the Western Frankish kingdom is paradoxically being the most developed in terms of feudalism and encapsulation, and in general, like the most functional imperially and military speaking, starts decaying and fragmenting, and apparently seems the most fragmented on that nominal political basis. Much of what goes on is that for example, the Viking invasions occurred largely because there were some noblemen locally that decided to side with those to sever their own territories, so to create enough disorder for themselves to have the reason, right, the excuse of taking over. Paradoxically, also, other communities recognized, including other noblemen, royal authority in a moment of great weakness and keeping it alive, exactly because they were complaining against the betrayers, right? It's not like the Vikings were doing that per se. And it's difficult, I realize, over the years to make people understand how actually solid and stable Western Europe was at this point, contrary to what is normally believed in this kind of catastrophistic, negativistic denial of the actual reality of powers that were very well anchored and gradually blossoming and booming, unlike other parts of the same Eurasia in the following centuries. Now, although many castles occupied commanding positions overlooking rivers, roads, or important sites for obvious reasons, they were rarely part of any deliberate, systematic border defense network for a political territory as such. All right? When you look at the political geography of, say, we mentioned before the Duchy of Normandy, the County of Anjou, these are all powerful, big principalities eventually by the High Middle Ages. They have, since their establishment, at least their development there, as these provincial centers. Some of them, especially, like, look at the County of Anjou. We made a video on it. It was a county. It was a smaller place. It was a local thing, right? Then what you see here by counties, this princely seigneury that maintains the comital title of Anjou as a lord who lords over many other counties that get taken over by this broader idea of the County of Anjou, right? That's how it works. The Duchy of Aquitaine, for example, is not like was the entirety of Aquitaine. The Duchy of Aquitaine was actually a small part of historical Aquitaine, together with other territories next to it. The lower Seine Valley, so what will become the Duchy of Normandy because of the settlement of the Northmen at the time of Charles the Simple, essentially as a buffer to hold, in fact, further Norse incursions upriver toward Paris, had sort of an obvious strategic function by the reason for which it was created was just stated, but also because it was very much out there, controlling the trade with England, bordering other powerful entities like not just the Ile-de-France, but as we said before, the County of Flanders, the Duchy of Brittany, and so on. And so castles in these places would be tendentially built in some cases, for some broader strategical purpose of that princely scale. A strangely dumb thing that historiography came up with at some point was claiming that there are such things like quote-unquote strategic castles and non-strategic castles. So aside from the fact that everything gains strategic relevance, even a fortified farm, if properly manned and there is some objective to achieve through its control, every castle in this sense is obviously built for some general military purpose. Any fortification has that. What this improper historiographical terminology meant is that essentially the word castles were built initially for more eminently military purpose, like saying this is not a settlement that got gradually fortified. I also made a video about the burgi, for example, the boroughs that are not necessarily meant the English way. Again, in Europe, we have different ways to term different things. In that case, they were mostly castles that sort of rise to defend particular centers and get, in fact, sort of absorbed by the same, or so in many different ways. But let's say essentially created by a lord like Fulk Neras that we mentioned before, that said, okay, for contrasting the Count of Blois as Count of Anjou, I need to place this castle here, this new castle there. Like, so to say, basically, let's create new castles that are specifically aimed at containing, for example, the expansion of a broader enemy at that level of scale, right? But as we explained before, castles were actually present everywhere by themselves, and so the broader strategic relevance that they would acquire was as fluid as the politics of it. So again, there isn't such like a thing like a specifically fixed boundary. There are armies that cross if they want, like the entire country, even just peacefully. So everything acquires its strategic relevance when it does, right? Or in anticipation of it, sure, but in this sense, not exclusively saying, I am the Duke of Normandy, and so I just have to build castles, say, I don't know, all around the border of Normandy with its neighbors. Like, it doesn't work like that. The so-called defense in depth is also obviously speaking of, you need properly a tissue, a connective tissue of castles to be a stable power to begin with, regardless of the castles that you would build at a frontier place, such as Chateau Gaillard, for example, evidently enough, like between Normandy and the Ile-de-France, as two great powers, also greater powers with England at that later age. In fact, castles at large had their primary function to provide, as we said before, a secure refuge for their owners in the moment, in the circumstance, and to exert control over the surrounding population to begin with. All right, the politics of this was unstable to the point, and warfare was so endemic, but with its own rationale and logic, including politically and strategically. And that's also, never think even how historiography has equally wrongly come up with at some point with the idea of the anarchy. There wasn't such a thing like an anarchy. All these seigneuries were doing something extremely effective and precise that brought eventually, in fact, to these powers to become bigger principalities that would be run as a whole, as eventually as part of kingdoms, and becoming, in fact, ever bigger, more functionally aligned with also this encastellated net. Defending the population for any evenience, like this was the main point of why a castle even existed, because the castle was also the product of the surplus given to the lord to defend the people. Again, this other myth is that the Middle Ages was a place where the poor peasants were simply under a tyranny of the evil lord. Actually, people had much less freedom in the early modern age, notoriously, and there was much more liberty at this point, telling the truth, but the large part of this seigneurial encapsulation happens by contract. Again, I made lots of videos already on the topic, on the relation between the peasants and their lords and so on. It was very often much more consensual than we tend to think. And in any case, external threats were more than enough to convince the peasants to have a functional hierarchy. And then, of course, you can debate of how this had come to be, meaning that, of course, in the ancient world, society was segmented in a different way. This is after the end of the Roman Empire, so the world is exhausted. Metaphysically speaking, people have, in part, just largely given up power to just fewer people that are hyper-specialized, like the knights, etc. There are the same lords. So again, everything is sort of part of a bigger picture that here we're not specifically discussing. In this way, by the way, the castle formed the core of a mandamentum, podesteria, district or territory, whichever you want to call it, also referred to as, in fact, salvamentum, potestas, districtus, or territorium, if you want to sort of Latinize them proper. And in fact, these terms denote varying concepts of lordly jurisdiction that varied practically across every place, right? Every seigneury had been born in different ways, with different customs, with different relations properly between the communities. It wasn't standardized or formalized. There were similar levels, layers, as we've seen, ranks, hierarchy across the countries, etc. But it was more part of a overall functionality that had come into being without some reform or sort of from the top or anything like that. They were essentially protected districts centered on the castles, reflecting how fortifications served also, in fact, as administrative and economic hubs, extracting resources and loyalty from nearby peasants and villages rather than purely military frontiers. You cannot separate politics, warfare, and society, right? This is a Clausewitzian and traditional concept. Now, exact numerical counts remain impossible due to the scarcity of written sources and the still limited state of archaeological research. Again, it costs a striking lot to dig anything. Besides, archaeologists make terrible disasters when they do this in many ways that I will not be digressing on. But if you're paid to get something and you find, say, something else in between, and I know of people that social archaeologists that hit that find just to go on with their own digging and even destroying some artifacts from different ages and structures. So that's criminal. I would I would pass a law for shooting such people on the spot whenever this crime is committed, as a matter of fact, because it's not possible. Like we must teach that such places are more important than people. Let's abandon this idiocy that human life has an inherent value just per se. It's all about potential. If you squander it in this way, that's a completely different story. So nevertheless, available evidence indicates that the overall number of castles, while never enormous, grew steadily over time. So never enormous in a sort of broader sense, like there wasn't a castle every 100 meters, but sort of, again, every almost. And in the Poitou, for example, only 3 castles are recorded before the Norman invasions. So we're talking the 9th century. Naturally, doesn't mean anything. There were many of them. There were hundreds, to say the least. But what does it mean here? But to say castle, because it could mean really different things. If we're talking about here, I don't want to digress in the terminology, but castrum is a pretty generic term in Latin. It could be anything, right? We just don't know. What we know, however, is that there is a way to count them in the way the sources conventionalize the term, so that Poitou, South of the Loire, here increases to 39 castles named, at least known, during the 11th century, by the 11th century. So basically, in 300 years, you have a decuplication of castles, which in this case, the sort of by scale gives you an idea what encapsulation in Europe actually meant, and how much potential and even material resources actually existed for those who have the moral capacity to harness them. This is actually the greatest lesson from high medieval Europe that you can get. So this western French province of Poitou, shaped by earlier Viking pressures along its coasts and shifting allegiances among Aquitanian, Poitevin, and Norman influences, witnessed accelerated building as local counts stabilized lands and competed for dominance in the post-Viking recovery phase as well. These Atlantic territories naturally were tendentially more exposed to Viking raids, but again, not even here can actually say that these castles were built because of the Vikings. That helped, but largely they would have built them anyway at some point. And it's really the political and social background of these lands that allows for this to happen. All right. Touraine had 9 castles at the end of the 9th century and 26 by the mid-11th. Again, these are sort of estimates in a general sense, but by scale here, for example, it's less than Poitou, but can we really say mathematically that we're sure about what these castles were in the way we intend? Like by the mid-11th, we kind of know better archaeologically what we're looking at, but by the 9th, it's sort of more complicated. Naturally, we have an idea also which settlements more or less existed at the time, but never to give it too much for granted. especially for the early Middle Ages, because there were many cities that literally rose and fell within the late Antique and early medieval period that were even bigger than others around that nobody knows anything. This is especially the case in the Mediterranean. But so you can reasonably look at a map of, say, these lands in Atlantic France and say, oh, well, okay, we know historically which were the most important centers, and so also dig in there and see more or less, we just know better for the bigger centers where the fortifications were, how they were built, and so on. But you may not really know how many castles existed by a river crossing, a particular crossroad, etc. The Loire-centered region around Tours benefited from fertile soils and river trade, but faced rivalries between Capetian kings and Angevin counts eager to secure transport routes and agricultural wealth through fortified estate centers. This was the broader problem, also the Capetian expansion later, that is, as the successfully unifying monarchy of this immense territory that it had been blessed by the control parts of the Seine and the Loire historically, because this from Frankish times were in royal hands as a whole. But during the aforementioned vassalatic fragmentation, you had again the Normans on the lower Seine that had paradoxically been installed there by the same late Carolingians at that point for reasons of defense. You have these other principalities down the Loire, that is sort of, the mouth of which is far away from Paris, and so controlling the riverways is incredibly important if you start building castles, and there are already important cities along these rivers. It's complicated to control everything. You have to besiege, to control, to acquire. It's very complicated. It's not just about warfare. It's also about patrimonial policy, dynastics, successions, inheritance, etc. The men possess no castle, at least if we have to guess here from the evidence before the 10th century, which doesn't make any sense, obviously, but still. Then 11 castles by 1050 and 62 by 1100, right? Which also shows, however, how realistically the later you come in time, the easier it is to understand here, for example, the acceleration in fortification as it was happening at this point. Naturally, France is a land of castles, as you understand, because of this feudal establishment. Positioned as a contested mark between Norman dukes and Angevin counts, this corridor of men. So explosive growth in fortifications, as we've seen, as rival powers maneuvered for territorial advantage in a strategically vital zone linking northern and western France. The Auvergne that we started with from the late antiquity, early Middle Ages, had 8 castles on the eve of the year 1000, and between 21 and 34 around 1050. You see here less castles because there is actually it's a poor land, but there is also different wealth distribution. Also in the county of Toulouse, for example, the sense is that the system was a bit more of a hybrid between a urban and a more classically rural system in feudal and institutional terms. So you don't have the same level of concentration that produces individual castles. It's not like wealth wasn't there, actually it was more evenly distributed, but for example, in strategic terms, this didn't help really much, as we've seen also during the Albigensian Crusade, right? Because those French knights from the north were much better organized in that way, unitary sense, whereas the Occitanians were more scattered here. And this is not just a structuralistic observation. This is, again, moral, spiritual, cultural. There was a reason if those people were Cathars, and or at least, they had this political disorder, and that brought to their instability and sort of incapacity to give form to their substance in a regional, national, country sense. As we said at the beginning, the Auvergne-rugged volcanic plateaus and hills, long suited to natural strong points, increasingly featured added mottes at this point, as regional lords distanced themselves from distant royal oversight and asserted local autonomy amid feudal pressures. Normandy counted roughly 10 ducal castles around 1035, and about 20 around 1100. Ducal castles, naturally there were many more. Under strong dukes, including Robert the Magnificent, who navigated internal factions and prepared for his son's minority, and his son William the Conqueror, who consolidated power after a turbulent minority conquered England in 1066 and imposed regulations to curb vassal challenges, these Norman holdings helped maintain ducal supremacy over vassals. In the territory of Chartres, some 20 castles are documented across 6,000 square kilometers during the 12th century. This area near the influential bishopric and royal heartlands experienced documented proliferation, reflecting ongoing frictions among church authorities, comital families, and emerging Capetian centralizing efforts. Certain regions, however, reached a form of saturation quite early as well. In the Mahonnais, where documentation is richer than elsewhere thanks to monastic archives like those of Cluny, 16 castles were already known by the year 1000, with only one more appearing between 1000 and 1050. Again, it can't be the best place to document at this point, but still we don't know 100% how many castles were actually there. This Burgundian zone prospers from trade and agriculture, yet politically fragmented among competing lordships drew detailed records, particularly, again, because of their institutions like Cluny that chronicle these early defense fortification networks. The church was pretty close, as we've seen, to these things. The same monks were from the same aristocratic families, so they were very interested, also for the sake of their congregation, in what was happening to the territories who ruled them. That was all at this point. We are in the prodromes of the Gregorian reform, so there is all this idea of the autonomy of now these congregations that become in fact united also to resist feudal encroachments, interestingly enough. So you understand, it's all part of the same picture. They also received donations from other faraway sovereigns at some point, in this case especially from Spain, but not only. And so when you look at these figures, you say, well, okay, maybe they're realistic, right? But they can be misleading as well in an absolute sense. They are usually recording only the major castles and ignore the numerous smaller fortified dwellings scattered across the countryside. So in that sense, from a historical and linguistic standpoint, it's imperative to realize, but what did they mean by these castles? Like, why did they count them? It's obvious that if they were fundamentally looking at the sort of, that they were looking for sure at a standard scale of castle that they intended as also overlapping, as we've seen, with a particular district, and so that they could easily quantify a certain level of power distribution, right? There weren't castles of simply literally every possible size. There was a scale, like a hierarchy of different ranks, so to say, of castles that would help the same rulers organize, rationalize their territorial domination. A detailed study of the small Chinglais region in lower Normandy, this is an upland plateau of roughly 240 square kilometers, so about 12 by 20, bordered by the Orne to the west, the Lez to the east, and the confluence of the two rivers to the north, and today comprising 48 communes, reveals, besides 3 or 4 stone castles, another 28 earthen fortifications. Right? Of these, 20 are still visible today, interestingly enough. So they're not simply even the majority of them. Remember what I said before, hundreds of fortifications for hundreds of square kilometers. This is probably indicating that. And you can easily understand this. Admittedly, every country has a bit of a different political balance, but there are some places in Europe where this is very well documented, very explicitly. You can see 13 mottes and 7 circular enclosures. Also, obviously realize that some of these castles were eventually expanded later. Many went destroyed, probably razed. So what you see today is obviously what remains from other times. Like there are some castles that were built in the Renaissance that had maybe castles that are, say, smaller castra that were already dated by the 12th century. Right, this is completely typical, and especially for the bigger castles. So this already tells us that the former castrum was maybe, yes, for some reason may have been similar to the others, but it was already well placed in a general sense for a bigger fortification to develop from there, and so it was likely already more important than others back in the day. The enclosures, by the way, are these is a term used by archaeologists for simple ditched and embanked rings with a palisade enclosing the space of one or more ordinary residential buildings, as we described it before. The shingle, with its characteristic mix of elevated plateau and riverine boundaries that facilitated both defense and local resource control, exemplifies how lesser earthworks completed larger stone sites, many of which persist as landscape features detectable through modern surveys despite centuries of erosion in agriculture. This distinction between different levels of fortification is clearly reflected in Article 4 of the Consuetudines et Justitiae, that is a Norman text from 1091, dating to the era, in fact, of William the Conqueror, who, as Duke from 1035, onward suppressed rebellions during his minority, including threats from uncles and neighbors, conquered England in 1066 at Hastings, and imposed tight regulations to prevent vassal challenges while managing threats from neighbors and internal unrest over such an extensive amount of territory. Right? You know that he was probably William the Bastard, and that he had to sort of initially put like a very strong and to an enormous series of vital threats to his own rule. So this is something which would be reinforced by castles. And this article says no one in Normandy was allowed to dig a ditch on the plain except in such a way that the earth from its bottom could be thrown outside without the help of a stool, nor to erect more than one line of palisade, and that without projection or walkway. Right, so just a sort of much lighter type of fortification, and the dukes must maintain actually a greater prerogative in that regard. This is very important because Normandy, in and of itself, was tendentially more power concentrated than other parts of France, including the Ile-de-France. Not necessarily for the better reasons, but the Normans were themselves fresh and impositive. They had a sense, paradoxically, of sort of more of a public authority, always in personal terms, but in this sense is more collectively binding. No one was allowed to fortify a rock or an island. The article says that no one was allowed to build a castle in Normandy, and no one in Normandy was allowed to refuse the force of his castle to his lord if the latter wished to take it for himself. This regulation aimed to thus curb unauthorized builds on flatlands, as we were saying before, so the most important parts, but also strategic natural features, while ensuring ducal access, part of broader Norman efforts, in fact, to further centralize military resources following internal wars like those after William's minority. Over time, stone castles built around a central keep gradually gained ground. However, this was the major stepping up of military engineering in the era. These keeps long remained cubic in shape, later became cylindrical, and from the 11th century onward frequently adopted a prismatic form. This evolution tended to favor the stronger and wealthier secular and ecclesiastical lords, obviously enough, that were ever more powerful and controlling, in fact, ever more castles and having the resources thus to build bigger ones in particular strategic positions. The spread occurred only gradually, of course, and varied by region and local conditions, appearing, for example, in earlier central France and later in Flanders, following, again, the spread from the Mediterranean mostly. Among the earliest known examples are possibly the keep at Langeais, located along the Loire and traditionally linked to construction efforts around 994 by Fulk Neraud of Anjou, as we've seen also in the video about him. So this prolific builder who erected dozens of strongholds to counter, as we were saying, the blood rivals and secure his expanding domains, despite scholarly debates over precise dating due to sparse sources, marking a key early shift towards fire-resistant and siege-defying stone fabric after an initial attack by Otto I of Blois prompting reinforcement. In around the year 1000, those at the Sault near Saint-Benoît-du-Sault in the Berry, a central French area where emerging stone keeps supported local consolidations of power among counts and lords navigating post-Carolingian uncertainties. Because of the great weight of stone construction, the artificial earthen motte itself soon fell out of use. This transition reflected improving masonry skills, economic growth allowing investment in permanent structures, and the need for fortifications capable of withstanding prolonged wars as feudal society matured in the High Middle Ages. So, test about who talked about what online about this stuff. Let's first of all see. I think this is an important premise in general for the channel. I didn't plan even this video to be so expansive and long. In fact, I'm checking how long this is in total, because as you know, you hear a single stream, but it actually is fairly fragmented. And wow, this is almost, seriously, it's more than 2 hours. Well, all right, that's exactly what I meant. That's where we need to get. So first of all, test how many people talked about this in on YouTube in general. It's probably also difficult to search for the right, what the hell, this, for the right term. So early medieval French castles. Predictably, there is literally nothing about it. It's all more modern castles. Let's put it in brackets. What the... Literally nothing. So basically, I know that sometimes YouTube does not propose you properly the... this is mine. I said, this is actually the video that... And as I see, maybe it doesn't appear in the sources, but again, there isn't, because the idea is that castles are just the later castles, the ones you can see, right, still today. So remember that there was an entire era where castles, aside from sort of major urban fortifications, were there, and we don't see them anymore. They were the way they were and how many they were. Far from being, again, scarce overall. We had to check this. Then we had to check how many other videos made on castles. This is the 6th video. Are we seriously talking about this? Only so few. We really need to make more about castles, but I also understand, like, say, as you've seen from this video, is that it's not much important to look at the technicality. More or less, if you're told what a motte looked like, you can easily spot it, and that's it. I think it's much more interesting to see, as we observe in this video, like, why this was even happening. All right, and that's the actual explanation. Why did castles exist? You get like a sort of pretty flat answer about the Middle Ages. No, we here see how things progressed and why. All right. But I think that this is okay. I'm glad to have made this videos. We're making more videos about medieval France in the last couple of years. I managed to, in fact, cover enough about it, but it's still too few. Only 129 videos here, I see. We really must make much more for this to be anywhere near satisfactory. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.